All right, thanks everybody. Apologies for the delay on that. We had a little bit of a technical difficulty getting the meeting started. Give me 1 second to get set up here.
Sure, no problem. John, I think you're muted.
Thank you so much for that. Appreciate it. So welcome to the March of the CAB Speaker Series. We've got Dr. Paul Rosen here to talk to us. Give us a talk on improving visualization through shape, discussion of topology-based methods in visualization. Paul is an associate professor in the Callart School of Computing and the Scientific Computing and Imaging Institute at the University of Utah. He received his PhD from Purdue University in 2010. Subsequently, he was a research assistant professor at the University of Utah and then an associate professor at the University of South Florida from 2015 to 2022. He has been the co-author of over 75 papers, 6 having received Best Paper Awards or honorable mentions in the areas of computer graphics, data visualization, and topological data analysis. His research interests lie at the intersection of scientific and information visualization, where he utilizes a mix of human-centered design and geometry and topology-based approaches to improve the efficacy of visualization tools. His research has been supported by the National Institutes of Health, National Radio Astronomy Observatory, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and National Science Foundation grants, including an NSF Career Award in 2019. He is also one of the general chairs for IEEE Viz 2024, which will be held in Tampa, Florida. And with that, I will pass this over to Paul.
Great. It says that the screen sharing is disabled. That works.
All right, that should be all set.
Okay. Please holler at me if you can't see that. Thank you for having me today. I am Paul Rosen. As I go through this, please feel free to interrupt me if you have questions. I'm happy to answer them as I go. So today I will talk a little bit about some of the work that we've been doing in topology-based methods in visualization. So I want to start with a little thought problem here, a little provocation, and it really has to do with how we see data. And so it's inspired by this particular paper, which is a generalization of Anscombe's quartet, where they allow a wide variety of different sets of data points to have similar statistical distributions. So if we watch this, you can see that a lot of different distributions of points all have very similar statistical properties. And despite the fact that we really do like statistics when we're analyzing data, my provocation is that really statistics is not the right way to think about how we actually see data when we're visualizing it. And so this whole idea that statistics is the failures of statistics are a motivator, or the weaknesses of statistics are a motivator for visualization, is kind of wrong in the sense that that statistics capture some great properties, but our eyes are interested in different properties. The property that you probably noticed about most of these is that they have very different shapes. So shape is a really big driver. If I asked you to describe any of these distributions, you would probably describe it by shape, not by statistical property. Maybe for some of them, if they're highly correlated, you might use correlation as a statistical property, or if they're clearly normally distributed, you might use that. But otherwise, you're going to say it looks like a star, or it looks like a circle, those kinds of shape type properties. So with that as our inspiration, my research group works to better visualization by using both geometric and topologic shape. I'll highlight the difference between those two in a few moments. And the other thing that my research group does is that we take a human-centered approach to this. So we aren't just concerned with the mathematics and algorithms of geometry and topology, but we're really concerned with how people actually interpret these things. And so we apply these in basically three broad ways, and you'll see examples of each of these ways today. The first one is that we try to make visualizations better. The second is that we're trying to better understand our data. So we're looking at how people perceive data to really understand how they understand their data. And the last thing that we do is we use these geometric and topological descriptors to better interact with our data. So as an interactive tool to kind of manipulate our data and manipulate our data visualization. So we've done this in a wide variety of areas that you see in the background. Today, I'm going to talk mostly about these two areas, which are in scalar field visualization and a little bit of network visualization. But as I said, each of these different areas really applies to many other data or application areas beyond just what I'm talking about. So for a little bit of background on me, you got some of this in the intro, but I did my PhD at Purdue University, and then I moved to the University of Utah, where I was a research professor for about 5 years. And then I went and did the tenure track thing at the University of South Florida. And just this year, I've moved back to Utah as a tenured professor here, which is kind of a weird path for people to take. Usually, you don't have cycles in your graph for academia, at least. But the reason I came back is because I sit in this institute called the Scientific Computing Imaging Institute. If you haven't heard of it, it's a fantastic place, and you should come visit us. It's an interdisciplinary institute. Our faculty come from a bunch of different departments. The largest group is computer scientists, but we have many other disciplines here. And it also happens to be the home of one of the largest collection of visualization experts, definitely in the country, perhaps in the world. And so it's a really stimulating place to work. And if any of you are interested in coming and giving a talk to a bunch of visualization folks, we'd be more than happy to have you give one virtually or in person. So let me give you a little bit of a description of what we're going to talk about today, which is we're really going to focus on topological shape descriptors. I'm not really going to talk about geometry too much. There's just a little bit, maybe 1 or 2 slides that have some geometry in it. So most people don't really know what I'm talking about when I talk about topology versus geometry. And so this example is helpful. So with topology, what we're really concerned about is we have a shape and we want to allow that shape to undergo some certain deformations. In particular, we want to allow it to do things like stretch or twist or compress. Those operations are kind of allowed in topological equivalency. Things that aren't allowed in topological equivalency are things like tearing or gluing or cutting. So the little holes that you see in this picture here, you can't cut the blue in order to make one of those holes disappear. That's not an allowed modification of a space with respect to a topological descriptor. So what this means is that these two pictures that you see here, the thing on the left is geometrically very different than the thing on the right. Right, you're not going to, in geometric terms, you're not going to describe them in any way as being the same thing. But in topological terms, you would actually describe them as being the same object. And so the way that we count these sorts of things is we count certain homology groups within a space. And so there are 2 homology groups I'm going to focus on today, and so I'll just mention these. The first one is what's known as the homology group 0, which are basically components. So you can see each of these pictures has one component associated with it. The other descriptor that we're concerned about here are what are known as homology group 1, which are basically the tunnels or the cycles that go through these different components. So in this context, both the thing on the left and the right have 2 objects, two tunnels that come from homology group 1. And so we would say these things are topologically equivalent because they have one H0 component and 2 H1 tunnels within them. So this is the really high level description of this. You're going to see some data structures that we use that are not going to look very closely related to this. So I'm just going to warn you ahead of time. But they are this sets up a lot of the mathematical foundations of how they work. Okay, so now let's dig into my three areas where the first of the three areas where my team and I actually work. And so the first one is in making visualizations better. And so we're going to talk about visualizing fields, particularly scalar fields, using topological data analysis. And so my description today is really going to come from one particular application that was relatively recently wrapped up, and this is in 3D scalar field analysis. It's a project that we did in collaboration with some radio astronomers. And so radio astronomers have like many people, they have a really big data problem. So this thing on the left is one example of their data. It's about 5K by 5K. And the thing that's really shocking about their data is that through all of that data, the feature of interest within the data is this little red blob that you see right here. That little red blob maybe covers 100 by 100 pixels out of an original data set that is about 5K by 5K. In addition to this being this really large data problem, it's a 3D data set. And so there are actually many layers to this, depending upon how many the scientist needs to do their evaluation. There could be 50 to several hundred layers of additional data that need to be processed just to extract these really small features from the data itself. So the radio astronomers approached us and they said, hey, we got this really big data problem. Most of it's noise. There's a little bit of signal. How can we find the signal faster? And how can we emphasize the signal? And so we said, we've got some tools for you, and they come from Topology. So in collaboration with them, we developed a small tool that we call LMA-TDA, and it allows them to load up a piece of their data. And this is a 3D cube of data. They can focus in on an area of interest that they know has some feature they're interested in, or they can analyze their entire data cube. And then they can use our topology-based approaches to both identify important features and then to denoise stuff that doesn't qualify as important features. So I'll talk a little bit about how we identify these features and then how we can also denoise. So this is our basic processing pipeline. We get the input data that you see on the left. We allow some user interaction. User interaction turns out to be pretty simple. It's just a single parameter that they can adjust. And under the hood, what we're going to do is we're going to compute this thing that's called a topological skeleton. It's going to be an abstraction of the topology of the scalar field. We're going to then apply some modifications to that topology, to the abstract topology. So we're going to remove features in that topological skeleton that are essentially noise. And then we're going to take those modifications and we're going to push them back into the image. So we're going to do scalar field modification. And then the hope is that when you're done, you get something that's in the ballpark of the thing that you see on the right, which has been significantly denoised. So let's talk about these different steps. So the first one is let's discuss just briefly the input data that these folks use. So their collection is collected using, their data is collected using radio interferometry. So essentially what they have is a bunch of different radio telescopes. They're set up in a very particular configuration, and then they analyze and correlate interference patterns between these different radio telescopes. And from those different interference patterns, they can identify signals at different spectral wavelengths. Okay, so very complicated input data. They have a whole bunch of high performance computing that goes into actually computing the data cube that you see at the end. So we don't touch this raw data that they collect here. We are only going to touch the data cube at the end. That's collected by analyzing everything coming back from these radio telescopes. And what these data cubes look like is they're three-dimensional things. So the two dimensions that are sort of the obvious dimensions basically map to position in the sky. as one would expect. They're looking up, they collect some information from some part of the sky. So that's going to be kind of a 2D thing. And then they're going to capture in the third dimension different wavelengths, different frequencies of signal. So that's where the third dimension of the cube comes from. And so the part of the resolution of the data along the sky tends to be very high resolution. They, it can be as small as 1 or 2K by 1 or 2K, but often as big as 5K by 5K or even larger. And the resolution within the spectral domain can vary widely based upon how much time they were able to observe the sky for a particular data cube, and how much spectral resolution the scientist who requested the observation actually needs. Okay, so that's the input data that we're looking at. So then we took this input data and we wanted to construct a topological skeleton on it. So the topological skeleton we use in this context is what's known as a contour tree. So a contour tree is going to look at data, scalar field data, and it's going to essentially look at this data from the perspective of a topological map. So it's going to sort of extrude this thing into a height map. Conceptually, it doesn't actually do that, but conceptually it extrudes it into a height map. And then once you have that height map, you're going to extract interesting features from it. And in our context, interesting features are critical points. So these are areas where the gradient is 0. And there are 3 types of those. There are local maxima, there are local minima, and then there are saddle points. So you see the saddle on the top and then local minima and maxima on the bottom. We just want to extract the critical points associated with these. Beyond that, we don't just want to extract the critical points. We want to relate the critical points to one another. And the reason we relate them is because these critical points can be used to cancel each other if we know their relations. We can do that cancellation. Okay, so conceptually, we're taking our input that's on the left here, and we're turning it into a height map like you see in the middle. And then we extract this thing known as a contour tree, where every node in the contour tree represents one critical point. And you have critical points such as local minima that you see right here. You have saddle points, such as the one that you see right here. And then you have some local maxima, which are also connected to some saddle points. So they're your local maxima as well. And you can see the thing on the right has some edges on it. These edges are formed by a method known as branch decomposition, or branch decomposition relates critical points to one another. But essentially these edges basically tell you which critical points are kind of connected to which other critical points, which is useful in the simplification of the resulting tree. Okay, so this tree is our abstraction of the complex data that comes from the left, right? Complex data from the left converted to height tree, abstracted into this much simpler representation, or at least much smaller data representation. So now we need to go through the process of doing a tree modification. So basically removing the things that are unimportant from the tree, or things that we consider to be noise from the tree. So the key insight of doing this is that the contour tree that you see here has the vertical position of these is noting the scale of the event. So what function value was associated with that particular critical point. We can then pair some features, and we pair these features by using this branch decomposition method that I briefly mentioned. And this pairing allows us to know that these 2 critical points, if we modify the field a little bit, we can make these 2 critical points cancel one another. And I'll show you a visual example of that in a moment. So that we know this saddle and this local maxima can be canceled, and the amount of energy, the amount of entropy that we need to put into the system in order to cancel that is basically a measurement of the difference in function value between those critical points. And we call this the persistence of the feature. So you have certain pairs of features that have low persistence, that is, you need to inject a small amount of energy in order to cancel those 2 critical points. And then we have other features which have high persistence, which basically require you to put a lot of energy into the system in order to cancel out those critical points. So what we're going to do is we're going to cancel the ones with small persistence, the ones that just require a little bit of energy being put into the system, and we're going to leave the ones that require a lot of energy alone. Okay, so what does that cancellation look like, right? Here we had a saddle and a local maxima. So here we have a saddle on the left and a local maxima on the right. And what we're basically going to do with our scalar field is that we're going to modify it, put some energy in, or in this case, really take some energy out of it, in order to scoot the local maxima on the right down to being at the same level as the saddle on the left. So there are a couple of steps here. You can see we're just sort of pushing the local maxima down, and eventually, as we push it down far enough, that local maxima disappears, as does the saddle point. Okay, this is now a monotonic region, right? It wasn't monotonic here, but now it has become a monotonically increasing region, and so you no longer have any critical points there. So we've erased those critical points. So we went from this being our original data to now simplified data with critical points removed that looks like this. Okay. So cool. We're going to identify all these low persistence features. We're going to use what you just saw in the previous slide to remove those things from the scalar field, and we hope to see the thing on the right. So the example that I gave you was for 2D contour trees, but it turns out that it's trivial to create 3D contour trees and do all the same stuff that I just showed you in 2D. And so since this was 3D data, it made sense to use 3D contour trees as our first attempt at simplifying the data. And we did it. So on the left, you see the input data, and on the right, you see the result of using 3D contour trees. And it turned out to be a gigantic flop, in that it really didn't remove much noise. Kind of softens the noise a little bit, but it doesn't really remove anything. It's still not a very good result. So it turns out here that their data in radio astronomy is very interesting, because the result of their analysis to convert those radio waves into these cubes basically leaves the signal correlated between different spectra. So a signal in one location in one spectrum is going to be related to a signal in another spectrum. But the noise patterns that you see are completely uncorrelated. So the noise patterns are completely different. Which is not usual. Usually if you have noise, it's going to sort of continue through a few different layers of your 3D data set, but here it doesn't continue at all. And so what we essentially ran into is a problem that's called topological pants. So when you have a set of noise that's going, in this case, it's going sort of vertically in slice 1, and then it's going at a 45-degree angle in slice 2, what ends up happening is, instead of these things being related to each other, that is sitting like one on top of the other and being able to be removed as sort of think of it as a bubble of noise, they sort of cross each other. And by crossing each other, they interconnect into, when we say topological pants, something that really looks like pants, right? So you have a feature in one slice that sort of connects to two in another slice, and by connecting to those two by connecting in a third slice, you can connect these two things that were unrelated in the first slice through by traveling through multiple slices. And again, this is only a feature of this uncorrelated noise pattern. The noise pattern had been correlated. This would not have been a problem, and our simplification technique would have worked fantastically. So we went back to the drawing board a little bit, and we decided that since the noise patterns are uncorrelated, we would simply treat the data as a stack of 2D data. So we're stacking it instead of using the cube itself. And so all of our processing for the results you're going to see from here is by treating the contour trees, the slices individually, and doing the contour trees in 2D as you saw earlier. So when we did that, we applied everything you saw, and the results looked almost like magic. they looked that good. So what you're seeing here on the left is the original data. The lower left is the original data. The upper left shows all of the critical points that we identified. So the critical points are colored by type. Doesn't really matter because there's so many of them, you can't really tell what's going on there. But you can see that there are a lot of them, which is kind of to be expected given the noise pattern that you're running into here. So there are a lot of critical points. Mostly they're very low persistence, so they require just a little bit of energy to remove them. So on the right, what we did was we simplified using a method that's very similar to what I showed you earlier. And here, all that we've really retained are the most important, the highest persistence features. That is this red peak right here and this blue peak, this blue valley that you see right here. And you can see in the result on the right that almost all the noise has been removed, and the feature itself remains very clear, very visible. A lot of times what they do here is they'll use like Gaussian smoothing, where the Gaussian smoothing will definitely smooth out the noise, but it also kind of blurs their signal. And here the really nice thing is that we left the signal pretty much undisturbed. Here's just another slice. So like I said, the noise patterns are not correlated. You can really see that here. The noise patterns they sort of, some of them look sort of similar, some of them don't look very similar. And so the noise patterns are uncorrelated, but the signals that you see, again, are correlated. And so once again, you can see that we were able to remove a ton of noise from these images. And these have really low signal to noise ratio, as you can probably tell. Like, this is a pretty small signal, and there's just a ton of noise in here. We can also explore different levels of simplification. So what I've shown you in those previous pictures are pretty extreme level of simplification, and that's not always what you want to do. Sometimes you want to be a little bit more careful about how much you simplify. And so we have this single slider that you use to control the level of simplification. So here's the full image. Again, you can see lots of critical points when we've simplified none. Sort of an unmanageable number of critical points. Here is another example where we've not gone whole hog at getting rid of the noise, but we've done a pretty good job. And you can see there's some bunch of blue dots that are left and some red dots that are left, and those are removed as we get a little bit more aggressive with our simplification. Again, the main feature remains relatively undisturbed, and the noise that surrounds it is generally removed. Another cool thing that we tried here was we looked at how well this simplification would help us if we want to do volume rendering of the 3D cubes, because that's something that they were interested in seeing a little bit more of, was whether there was something to be learned by looking at the shape of the data in the spectral domain. And so here you can see some examples of the data in the spectral domain being 3D volume rendered. And you can see on the left, when you just use the original data, it's really hard to see what's going on inside of the main signal. And on the right, the signal is pretty clear. Just by way of explaining actually what you're seeing here. So this is a spinning disk. So this is a bunch of matter that's spinning around a black hole. And what you're actually seeing here is a Doppler effect. So as material is moving towards us, the wavelength shrinks, and as material is moving away from us, the wavelength expands. And so even though this is the spectral domain, things that are further away in the spectral domain are things that are actually moving away, and things that are closer in the spectral domain are things that are actually moving towards us. And so it sort of looks like it's spinning around a disk, but that's only a coincidence. This is really the wavelengths of the radio waves being generated by the matter. Okay, so that's one big example of where we were able to use these topologically based approaches to improve our visualizations. We've done this in other domains. Just simply mention quickly, we've done a bunch of work doing this in vector fields. So we've done this for tracking features in time-varying vector fields, and we've also done this for simplification of vector fields. So if you want to remove if you have a bunch of critical points in your vector field that you'd like to remove, we can remove them by minimally distorting the original vector field, which is a really nice quality of our work. We've also used a related structure in a related data structure called a Moore-Snell complex in an application where we looked at nuclear engineering and doing some sensitivity analysis in nuclear engineering simulations. And that was with some folks actually at Idaho National Lab, some domain scientists at Idaho National Lab. Okay, so let me move on to my next topic. So the next topic is better understanding data. And so this largely encompasses doing user studies on shape perception in 3D visualizations. So it happens that this is actually, this first study comes from my very first study that I did as an undergraduate. This was published all the way in 2004, and the work was done in 2003, so about 20 years ago. And what we did was we looked at how people perceived shape distortions in a 3D display. And what we were trying to understand was the difference between an LCD, monocular vision, binocular vision, and then the ability to navigate around the space. So those were the conditions we looked at. We looked at looking to identify whether people could see distortions in when they looked at models that were distorted in an LCD, when they had one eye covered, when they had both eyes available, and then when they had both eyes available but also could move around the display. So I won't go into details of these results, but I'll simply say that, but I'll give a quick summary, which is to say that there wasn't a lot of, when the person's position was fixed, there wasn't a lot of improvement when they were allowed binocular vision or monocular vision within this particular 3D display. Basically, they performed on par with using an LCD. The only place where we saw significant improvement was when people were able to move around. So for those of you who are doing VR these days, what this really calls to is the benefit of that VR gives you, which is you can actually like walk around your data, walk around your object, and understand it a little bit better spatially than you can do when you're in a fixed position, like looking at a monitor. More recently, we've been looking at comparing people's ability to detect features in topology-based visualizations. So here we're looking at 4 different visualization types. We're looking at color maps, which are, of course, a reference visualization, which is very commonly used whenever you're doing scalar field visualization. On the lower left, we're looking at isocontours, which is fairly commonly used as well. And it turns out contours are a key element of calculating the topology of the space. So they're kind of our first topology-based visualization. On the upper right, you see something that's called a reeb graph. A reeb graph is very related to that contour tree you saw earlier. It's identifying the critical points and connecting them. There's some nuances to the difference, but I won't go through those in this particular context. And then the last visualization on the lower right is a scatter plot-based visualization called a persistence diagram. This persistence diagram is capturing those pairings of critical points that I was talking about earlier. It captures them and basically shows how important those different pairs of features are. So it shows that persistence value of the different features. So in this particular picture, you can see over here, there are these 2 high persistence features. And then everything near this diagonal is considered to be noise or low persistence. So what we wanted to do was we wanted to compare how well people could detect changes in their data using these different visualizations, how well people could see, could basically compare 2 visualizations compare 2 data sets in any of one of these visualizations. So we wanted to look at different types of data variations. So we start with a baseline visualization here in the middle, and the 2 types of variations we were concerned with, was first a positional variation. So you have some signal. In this case, they're represented by 3D Gaussians, and you move that signal. So that's the first kind of variation that we were interested in looking at. And you can see just from the pictures, these are at least this large movement is pretty easy to detect in color maps and isocontours and in that reeb graph. The other type of variation we were interested in were amplitude variations. So basically taking this 3D Gaussian, making it brighter or darker. That's the other type of variation we want to see. And as you can see on the bottom, this is pretty clearly visible in the color map, somewhat visible in the ISO contours, not really visible in that Reeb graph, and not really visible, and a little bit visible in the persistence diagram that you have to look kind of closely to see it. So what we wanted to do was we wanted to test this in the wild with more complex data than just this example that you've seen right here. So what we did was we set up an experiment that looks something like this. We have a baseline visualization in the middle, and we show two distorted data sets to the left and the right. One of them is distorted more, one of them is distorted less, and we asked human subjects to tell us which one they thought was more similar to the thing in the middle. We did this with 102 non-expert subjects, and we had the following results, which were a bit surprising to us. So these pictures that you're going to see, they're a little bit complicated, but the thing to understand is accuracy is going up. So the higher the bar is, the more accurate the subjects were. And then left to right, we're looking at the amount of distortion. So things to the right, we expect higher accuracy because we expect the distortion to be larger, and that should, in theory, be easier to detect than small amounts of distortion. So the really interesting results here were that of all the four visualizations we tested, only Reeb graphs were actually useful in detecting movements in the position of those Gaussians changing. None of the other visualizations were able to, were subjects able to determine more accurately than basically guessing. For amplitude variations, what we found was that subjects were good at detecting amplitude variations with color maps, but they were very, very good doing it with persistence diagrams. So these results, particularly with Reeb graphs and persistence diagrams, kind of line up with our existing knowledge of what features they capture and what features they highlight. The interesting case was really ISO contours, which I think a lot of people use and a lot of people like and a lot of people think are useful. With ISO contours, we did see some ability to detect amplitude variation, but it wasn't statistically significant. So there's kind of weak signal there at best. And with respect to positional changes, ISO contours were just guessing. So ISO contours kind of came out the loser in this whole experiment, which was very, very interesting to us. So the implications here, if your data or you're looking for positional variations in your data, think about using topological data structures such as the Reeb graph or a contour tree. If you're looking for amplitude variations in your data, think about persistence diagrams or color maps or maybe ISO contours. And if you're looking for both, there's no single method that you should use. You should use multiple visualizations in order to identify both types of variations. Okay, the last area that I'll discuss today is how we can use topology to better interact with our data, and I'm going to do this in the context of graph drawing. So this is another area that I work in heavily. I've worked in heavily over the past few years. So when we're drawing a graph, drawing a network, what we hope is that we get something that looks like one of these two things. These are both very beautifully drawn networks where you can really analyze them quite easily. Make some decisions based upon what you see. There's really no complications with these graphs. The reality is most of the time when people want to draw their graphs, they look much more like this. They look like hairballs, they look like they have indistinguishable structures. So like the things on the right, one of those is a tree. The other one is a bipartite graph. Can't tell the difference. I don't even know which one's which because their structures look almost the same, even though the underlying structure is quite different. So the reality of graph drawing is much less pleasant than the idea of graph drawing. So our idea is basically to take a graph, add topology, and get a better graph visualization. So take a hairball like you see on the left, add some interaction via topology, and get the really cool that you see on the right as output. So the way that we do this is we take a graph, we apply a metric to the graph so that we can embed it into a high dimensional space, embed it into a metric space. We then run something there called a technique called persistent homology. I won't go into the details of that today, not enough time for it, but we run a technique called persistent homology. This is going to extract for us a set of H0, homology group 0 components, a set of H1 cycles or tunnels through the data, and we're going to use those things in order to drive the way that we actually draw the graph and the way that we interact with it. Okay. So again, won't go into the details because you don't have context for this persistent homology algorithm, but the important thing is that we've made some contributions in the calculation of these, basically by distilling this down to the calculation of a maximal spanning tree of the graph. So instead of having to calculate this metric and do all these homology calculations, you calculate this maximal spanning tree, keep some extra information as you're calculating it, and then the H0 features, the components, are going to be represented by the edges of that spanning tree, and then the non-spanning tree edges of the graph basically represent the cycles or the tunnels through the data. So this is really nice because this can be calculated on really large graphs really quickly. There's no scalability issue with this calculation. Okay, so then we said, now let's use this stuff to interact with graphs. What's the best way to interact with graphs? Well, we decided it was force-directed layouts, because force-directed layouts are iterative things that allow for interaction as you're going, and they are constantly optimizing, excuse me, constantly optimizing their layouts. So if you apply new forces or you move a node or whatever, the rest of the graph will adapt to those particular changes. So there are two main phases of force-directed layouts. The first one is to randomly initialize node positions. The second one is to iteratively solve this physically based system. So we impacted both of these. I'll briefly mention the initialization because it's cool, but doesn't really have anything to do with interacting, which is the part I'll focus a little more on. So as I mentioned, we calculate this maximal spanning tree, and it turns out that this maximal spanning tree is a really good way to initialize a graph layout. So you calculate one of these things and you lay it out in either a layered layout or in a radial layout before you do any of the force-directed layout calculations. So here's an example of this. On the top, you see just a random layout, and then the bottom two rows are the radial and layered layout approaches. What you'll notice is when we initialize things, random layout's just a big circle because these are random positions. And in ours, you can see something's happening, but you can't really see any particular structure. But you can see it's sort of looks like it's got some structure sort of coming out, some structure that's forming, but it isn't quite visible yet. The result of doing that is that our approach shows structure much earlier in its computation. So here on the bottom two rows, we're seeing after 5 iterations, structures are already starting to form, whereas you don't really see structures in the standard approach until 25 iterations in this particular example. The end result is also a graph that shows the structures a little bit better. So again, on the top, the structures are there, but they're a little bit looser in nature. They haven't quite tightened up the way that the structures have tightened up in our approach. And this has pretty real implications because it means that you can cut off your computation a lot earlier, or you can start to see the structure of your graph a lot earlier in the computation. And the convergence of this particular graph took several minutes to complete. So it really does make a difference if you can cut iterations from the initialization. So then the part that we really care about in the context of what I'm talking about today is the iterative solving of the physically based system. So here what we're going to do is we're going to take the forces of a force-directed layout and we're going to add new forces. So the normal forces you see in a force-directed layout are these spring-like forces that attract nodes, and then repulsive forces that cause all nodes to push apart. The hope is that you balance these two types of forces and you get a nice graph layout. In addition to those, we're going to add some topology-related forces. The first type we're going to add for those zero-dimensional persistent homology features are going to be some extra attractive forces that are going to attract pairs of nodes together, extra attraction of pairs of nodes together, and then some additional repulsive forces, which are going to repulse subsets of nodes from one another. So here on the left, you can see the contraction being used. It's being applied to all of the topological features within the graph. And on the right, you're seeing the that repulsion force, which is just being applied to one topological feature. So we use that one topological feature to split the data into two subsets, and we have those subsets push against each other. Here we can see an example of this on a real-world graph. This is a graph from Senate voting records. And so what you can see is initially it's just a hairball, but as soon as you apply these topological features, the graph bunches up, and as you would guess, Democrats vote with Democrats and Republicans vote with Republicans. That's kind of the result of what the graph showed in this particular context. The other type of feature that we can identify is the one-dimensional homology features, which are the cycles or the tunnels through the data. And so we can also apply forces to these one-dimensional features. And the way that we do that is we take the original graph, we do some parameterization of the cycles that we identify. We set target locations for them, and we basically attract the respective nodes. We apply a force to kind of draw them towards those target locations. So this is really cool because a lot of times you get graphs like this that when you initially lay them out, they're tangled, but we can identify some of the cycles and we can apply one of these forces that's elliptical. And what it does is instantly untangles the graph. Beyond that, there are cycles that are within the graph that are also hidden just by the natural layout of the graph. You know, the forces, it's an over-constrained system, and some of the over-constraints will squeeze some of these cycles together, even twist them. And you can go through the cycles, and individual cycle, you can kind of have it expand, and then you can relax it so that you can investigate what's going on with that cycle and then move on to other parts of the graph. We've used topology in several other applications in graph drawing. One example is in graph skeletonization. So here, the top graphs that you see are all the same. They just have a different color map on each of them. And on the bottom are different perspectives on skeletonizations of this particular graph. And so you can see that several of them summarize the graph in really nice ways, and they preserve different properties in those different skeletonizations. So you can analyze them with respect to what's important to you in your context. The other application we've looked at is identifying features in long-running time-varying graphs. So if your graph that runs, this particular one you're seeing ran over almost 2 years. So you have a really long graph where it's collecting the data every day for 2 years, and you want to see where there are interesting features happening. Well, we were able to use these approaches in order to identify where those important features were happening, and then we were able to correlate them with things that were happening at the world in the time of these various events, as well as identifying cyclical patterns. Like, this is an email network, so like, people send more emails on Monday than they do on Saturday or Sunday. Those kinds of features were easily detectable using our approach. Okay, so I'll sort of wrap it up here. Shape's a really, really powerful perceptual and cognitive signal. So it's really important for understanding data. And we can leverage shape in visualizations to improve the presentation, understanding, interaction, simplifying the data, so on and so forth. So hopefully I've sort of inspired you to maybe take a look at using some of these approaches within your work. Clearly, there's a lot you still have to learn in order to actually use these. But if you do want to get started, the best recommendation is to go ahead and try out the Topology toolkit. I'm not involved in the development of this, but some of my good friends and colleagues are. It is a peer review plugin that has a lot of topology-based methods implemented in it. That if you're already using peer review, it's really easy to start applying these, and they have a bunch of great tutorials and demos that you can use to start learning about this stuff more deeply. Another way that you can get involved is that we have a workshop at IEEE Biz 2023, which is called Topo in Biz. So this is broadly any topology in biz. If you're interested in writing a paper for it, that would be great. The abstracts are due on June 21st. But I also encourage us to check out what's happening there if you're at Biz or after the fact. come read some of our papers, talk to our authors. It'll give you a sense of what's going on within the topology and visualization community. And so with that, just want to thank all of my collaborators who've helped me with this work, as well as my research funding sources. And I'm happy to take any questions if you have any.
Okay. Wow. Thank you for that presentation. That was a lot of fun, very visually inspiring as well. Helped me think about some of the data pieces that we are starting to interact with, and probably some ways where we might be able to collaborate. So that's really cool. Any questions from the audience? Feel free to speak up or put them in the chat. I'll read them off. I'll start out with a question of sorry, go ahead.
I think that was me. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I lost track of my question. I think what I wanted to ask is, are there hardware limitations with any of the topology studies that you're doing?
So we've really focused on making these things usable. And so the stuff that I've presented is all practical. That said, it's been hard to get there. So that stuff I was talking about with respect to graphs, the persistent homology calculations, if you use the persistent homology calculations out of the box, the sort of vanilla standard ones, their scalability is challenging. I'll put it that way. But we made an effort to identify something that was justifiable and it could be easily calculated. Some of the other methods, like the stuff you saw with contour trees, tons of research has gone into making those parallel. And even then, they're not quite linear, but they're not much worse than linear in complexity. And so really, they're practical on very large scale data.
Great, thanks. Any other questions? Okay. All right. Well, with that, I just want to thank you again for taking the time to put this together and taking the time out of your day to chat with us. Really, really appreciate that. Hopefully, this spurs on some ideas in the visualization community, and hopefully that turns into some outreach as well for you. But yeah, I see a lot of applause and some thank yous coming in from the audience. So really appreciate it. Everybody, hope you have a wonderful afternoon and enjoy your weekend. And thanks for tuning in.
Yeah,
great. Thanks for having me.
Great talk, Paul. I'm glad to see it's in Pairview. I'm going to try out the Pairview.
Yes, you should. It's a great toolkit.
Yeah, I know one of my team members is going to be very, very excited about that Pairview toolkit. So
Very good.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.